She refused the CEO's money, so he learned how to love without rescuing her. The chair had trust issues, at least, that was Lily's professional diagnosis. Sophie Lane was crouched on the floor of Second Chance Workshop, one knee pinning down the leg of an antique walnut chair, while her phone was trapped between her shoulder and ear. Rain ticked against the front windows of the little Portland shop, turning the street outside into a gray watercolor of umbrellas, brake lights, and people pretending they were not miserable. "Yes, Mr. Halpern, I understand the rent is increasing," Sophie said, tightening a clamp with more force than necessary. "I'm just asking whether revitalization adjustment is a fancy phrase for we found richer tenants." On the other end, her landlord did not laugh. In the corner, Lily Lane sat cross-legged beside a row of broken lamps, bent picture frames, and one deeply offended ottoman. She had a notebook open in her lap. The chair Sophie was repairing had already been named Sir Wobbles. "He has a bad relationship with gravity," Lily announced. Sophie covered the phone. "Sir Wobbles is healing. He is plotting. He is furniture. That's what he wants you to think." Sophie tried not to smile, because smiling while your landlord explained that your rent was about to rise by 28% felt legally wrong. By the time she ended the call, her stomach had tightened into the familiar knot. Rent, materials, Lily's school fees, the overdue invoice from the lumber supplier, the roof leak near the back wall, and the quiet, constant fear that her father's old workshop was going to become another boutique selling candles named after emotions. The bell over the door rang. A man stepped inside, shaking rain from the shoulders of a very expensive suit. He did not belong there. That was Sophie's first thought. He looked like he should be standing in a glass lobby, not between a stack of cracked dining chairs and a dresser missing 3 handles. Tall, polished, mid to late 30s, with the confident posture of someone who had never had to calculate whether replacing a light bulb could wait until Friday. He scanned the room. "This is not what I expected," he said. Sophie stood, wiping sawdust from her hands onto her jeans. "People usually say that before they ask if we sell new things. Do you? No good." He moved closer to a display near the window and almost sat on Sir Wobbles. Sophie opened her mouth. Too late. The chair dipped violently to one side. The man grabbed the workbench, caught himself, and managed not to fall only through the kind of core strength wealthy people developed from private trainers and emotional repression. Lily looked up from her notebook. "He's rich," she said, "but not chair-smart." The man straightened slowly. Sophie pressed her lips together. "That was Sir Wobbles. He's in treatment. I can see he's committed to the process." "Not committed enough." The man looked at Lily. "Should I apologize to the chair?" Lily considered. "Only if you mean it." For the first time that morning, Sophie laughed. The man introduced himself as Mason Hart. That changed the air in the room. Sophie knew the name. Everyone in the neighborhood did. Hartwell Urban Development had been circling the district for months, along with Derek Vale's company, both of them using words like renewal, mixed use, opportunity, and adaptive luxury, words that usually meant people like Sophie would soon be invited to leave places their families had kept. Alive, Mason noticed the change in her face. "I'm just looking around," he said. "That's what developers call hunting when they're indoors." He smiled, not offended. "Fair." He asked about the shop, about the furniture, about why she repaired things that were probably cheaper to replace. Sophie should have given short answers. Instead, because he listened better than she expected, she told him the truth. Her father had opened Second Chance Workshop 32 years ago. He believed old things carried the fingerprints of everyone who had loved them. A table was never just a table. It was Thanksgiving arguments, homework tears, birthday cakes, late bills spread under bad lighting, hands resting across wood during apologies. Mason's expression shifted, not pity, attention. Sophie disliked how much she noticed. Then his gaze fell on the stack of envelopes near the register. Rent notice, supplier invoice, insurance reminder, the ugly little paper trail of a business trying not to drown. She moved to cover them. He saw enough. "How far behind are you?" The question was too direct. Sophie's spine stiffened. "I don't discuss my finances with strangers who attack injured chairs. I didn't attack him. He ambushed me. Sir Wobbles maintains his innocence." Mason glanced toward the rain-streaked window, where the street outside was already marked by survey flags and development notices. He knew Derek Vale had made aggressive offers on several buildings nearby. He knew the landlord was likely preparing to force out smaller tenants before selling, and Mason did what he always did when a problem presented itself. He reached for the fastest solution. "I can cover what you owe," he said. "Rent, materials, repairs, call it a community preservation grant." The shop went quiet. Even Lily looked up. Sophie stared at him. You've known me for 20 minutes. I've seen enough to know this place matters. No, you've seen sawdust, unpaid bills, and a chair with a grudge against humanity. Sophie, no. Her voice sharpened. You don't get to walk in here, nearly injure yourself on antique furniture, and buy the right to feel noble. Mason went still. A customer near the back shelves pretended very hard not to listen. Sophie felt heat rising in her face, but she did not stop. Men like you always think money is the cleanest kind of help, but sometimes it's just a prettier leash. Sometimes you aren't saving anyone. You're buying a version of the story where you get to be good. The words hit harder than she expected. Mason looked at her, and for once, he had no smooth answer. He had meant to help, truly, but the fact that he had meant well did not erase the way he had reached for her life like a problem on a balance sheet. Lily climbed down from her stool, walked to a small jar on the workbench, and selected a screw with grave importance. She held it out to Mason. If you want to help, she said, start with Sir Wobbles. He doesn't accept checks either. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Mason looked at the screw, then at Sophie. Does Sir Wobbles accept incompetent labor? Sophie crossed her arms. He accepts humility. Incompetence is extra. Mason removed his suit jacket, folded it carefully, and then seemed unsure where a man was supposed to put dignity when kneeling on a dusty floor. Lily pointed. Floor. He sat badly. Sophie handed him the chair leg. Hold this steady. I run a development firm. Congratulations. Today you're a clamp. He held the leg while she worked the glue into the joint, fitted the screw, and tightened the brace. It was slow, awkward, undignified. His shirt cuff picked up a streak of dust. His knee landed in a small pile of wood shavings. Lily gave him unsolicited performance notes. But he stayed. No checkbook. No solution large enough to swallow the room. Just Mason Hart, billionaire developer, sitting on the floor of a failing workshop, learning that some things could not be fixed from above. Sophie glanced at him once while turning the screwdriver. She did not trust him, but she did not ask him to leave. And for that morning, that was enough. Mason Hart returned to Second Chance Workshop 4 days later, with a toolbox that looked as if it had been designed by a luxury car company during an identity crisis. It was matte black, lined with titanium, and probably cost more than Sophie's first car. Sophie stood behind the counter, holding a chipped teacup in one hand and a receipt calculator in the other. She looked at the toolbox, then at Mason, then back at the toolbox. That thing has better insurance than I do. Mason set it on the workbench with unmistakable pride. It has a magnetic locking system. It's a screwdriver box, Mason, not a bank vault. Lily appeared from behind a stack of dining chairs. Wearing safety goggles too large for her face, she circled the toolbox like a tiny appraiser. Does it know how to fix things by itself? No, Mason admitted. Then it's just a fancy lunchbox for metal sticks. Sophie nearly dropped the teacup. Mason accepted the insult with the dignity of a man, slowly discovering that 9-year-olds were worse than shareholders because they lacked financial fear. He had come prepared to help. Unfortunately, Mason's definition of help still had architectural drawings, estimated timelines, and the phrase efficiency upgrade hiding somewhere inside it. Sophie shut that down before he finished the second sentence. If you say optimize workflow in my father's workshop, the ghost of every broken chair in here will attack you. So she gave him 3 simple jobs. Sand a table leg, sort screws, make coffee. By noon, Mason had created 1 table leg with the texture of nervous cheese, sorted screws by what he called visual confidence, and brewed coffee so bitter, Lily took 1 sip and declared it brown sadness. Sophie laughed so hard she had to sit down on Sir Wobbles, who to everyone's surprise held firm. That became the first real victory of the day. Mason kept coming back. At first Sophie assumed it was guilt, then curiosity, then perhaps a rich man's strange desire to win approval from a child who had given him a C- in chair empathy. But the pattern became harder to dismiss. After work, Mason would arrive without his jacket, roll up his sleeves, and ask what needed doing. He learned which rags were for stain and which were for dust. He learned that a Phillips screwdriver was not the cross-shaped one. He learned not to sit on anything Lily had named after a moral weakness. He also learned when not to speak. That was slower. Sophie allowed him to help with her cash flow spreadsheet after he promised not to turn the shop into a scalable heritage retail concept. Even then, she crossed out half his suggestions. Too corporate. Too suspicious. This sounds like you're trying to acquire me through Excel. Mason looked offended by that one, mostly because it was uncomfortably accurate. Still, he listened. That mattered. One rainy evening, while Lily painted tiny flowers on the drawer of a restored nightstand, Sophie told him the truth about her family in pieces. Lily was her niece, not her daughter. Sophie's older sister, Rachel, had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, Lily's father had never been reliable, and after Rachel's death, Sophie had become Lily's temporary guardian, then permanent in every way except the legal language that still made her nervous. The shop was not just income. It was proof that she could provide, proof that Lily had stability, proof that Sophie was not simply a grieving aunt improvising motherhood with glue stains on her jeans. If she lost Second Chance Workshop, she might not lose Lily immediately, but the fear lived in her anyway, sharp and constant. Mason understood then why the check had insulted her. He had thought he was offering relief. To Sophie, he had offered evidence that she could not stand on her own. In return, he told her a little about his father, who had been a builder before Hartwell became a name printed on cranes and zoning proposals. Mason had grown up watching his father come home with cracked hands and sawdust in his hair. Back then, building meant making something useful with your body. Now Mason built things through contracts, permits, and rooms full of people saying projected value. He had become rich enough to solve problems quickly, and somewhere along the way, speed had started to feel like virtue. Then Derek Vale's letter arrived. It was folded in a white envelope that looked clean enough to be threatening. Sophie read it twice in silence. The building owner, under pressure from Vale's redevelopment group, was raising maintenance fees and demanding immediate code compliance updates. The electrical system in the workshop had been flagged. If repairs were not completed within 14 days, the lease could be terminated. Sophie's face went still in the way people went still when panic had no room to move. Mason reached for his phone. He could have 3 electricians there by morning, 5 if he used the emergency vendor list, 12 if he felt dramatic. Sophie saw his hand move. "No, I haven't said anything. You were dialing with your cheekbones." He lowered the phone. She explained what would happen if his company fixed it. Derek Vale would claim Mason was secretly backing her. The neighborhood would think she had sold herself to one developer to escape another. Every small business owner fighting to stay would look at her differently. For the first time, Mason did not argue. He asked what she wanted. The question looked strange on him, like work boots with a tuxedo. Sophie exhaled. She wanted options, names of independent electricians, a way to understand the code notice, a meeting with the other shop owners before Derek picked them off one by one. So Mason gave her those things. Not through a press release, not through a check, through a list quietly assembled, with no Hartwell logo at the top. The meeting happened in the back room of a bakery that smelled like cinnamon, yeast, and collective dread. The room was full of small business owners, a florist, a barber, a bookstore couple, a tailor, the bakery owner, and Mr. Alvarez, who had run a corner grocery for 31 years and trusted developers about as much as he trusted raccoons near produce. Mason stood at the front for exactly 20 seconds before losing the room. He began by saying Hartwell could explore a community stabilization fund. Mr. Alvarez interrupted without raising his voice. That somehow made it worse. He said every developer arrived with the word community in one hand and a contract in the other. He said he had seen murals preserved while the people who painted them were priced out. He said he did not need Mason Hart's sympathy if sympathy came with a demolition schedule. Mason's jaw tightened. Sophie stood before he could respond like a CEO. She told him that if he wanted to help, he had to sit down and hear people before offering solutions. The room went silent. Mason looked at the folding chair beside him. It was metal, slightly bent, and obviously unaccustomed to billionaires. He sat. For 2 hours, he listened to the florist talk about funeral arrangements for families who paid in installments. He listened to the bakery owner describe feeding children before school because their parents worked early shifts. He listened to the tailor explain that half his customers came not because they had money, but because repairing clothes was cheaper than replacing them. The neighborhood was not underperforming real estate. It was memory with rent. By the end, Mason's notes had stopped looking like a development brief and started looking like apologies he had not yet learned how to make. Afterward, outside under the bakery awning, Sophie handed him a paper cup of coffee. It was terrible. He drank it anyway. "You did pretty well," she said. He tried not to look pleased. "Really? You only interrupted 17 times with your CEO face. That's significant progress." "My usual number is closer to litigation." Sophie laughed, not politely, actually laughed. Mason looked at her beneath the bakery's yellow light, rain silvering the sidewalk behind her, and felt something warm and inconvenient settle in his chest. It was not victory. It was not rescue. It was the quiet pleasure of being allowed to remain after being corrected. And Sophie, watching him drink terrible coffee without trying to improve it, felt her suspicion loosen by one careful inch. By the third week, Mason Hart had become part of the strange ecosystem of Second Chance Workshop. Not an owner, not a sponsor, not a savior. More like an expensive stray cat that kept showing up after work and slowly learned where not to sit. Sophie pretended not to notice how naturally she began expecting him. Around 6:30, the bell over the door would ring, and Mason would enter with his tie loosened, sleeves already rolled, carrying takeout coffee he had not made himself because everyone had agreed coffee was a threat to public morale. He helped Sophie restore an old wedding table for a young couple who could not afford a new one but wanted something with history. The table had water rings, a cracked corner, and initials carved underneath from a marriage that had ended long ago. Mason studied it and said the piece had legacy complexity. Sophie handed him sandpaper and told him to stop flirting with furniture in corporate language. Another evening they spent an hour choosing paint for Lily's room. Sophie wanted pale blue. Mason suggested calming slate. Lily rejected both and chose a color called Dragonfly Confession, which looked suspiciously like green. Mason asked who named paint colors. Lily said probably adults who had lost control of their feelings. After closing, they ate pizza on the workshop floor. Sitting between half-repaired chairs and a dresser missing one drawer, Mason got sauce on his shirt. Sophie laughed before she could stop herself. He looked down at the stain and said it was the first thing he had worn in years that had developed a personality. The warmth between them grew in small, inconvenient ways. His hand brushed hers when they reached for the same tool. She began saving the least burnt slice of pizza for him. He stopped trying to improve the shop's systems unless invited. She stopped flinching every time he used the word plan. Lily, meanwhile, began a formal evaluation. She taped a paper chart to the wall titled, Mason Hart Restoration Progress Categories included. Holds hammer correct way. Does not call everything an asset. Can apologize without budget proposal. Understands chairs have feelings. Does not panic near glitter glue. Mason received a C+. He stared at the chart like a man reading a hostile acquisition notice. This is the harshest performance review of my career. Lily patted his arm. You have good bones. Sophie almost dropped a box of hinges. But the softness frightened her. It was easier to distrust Mason when he was just a rich man with a checkbook. It was much harder when he was kneeling on her floor, trying to repair a drawer pull, letting Lily explain that some objects needed encouragement before screws. Then Mason made the mistake she had been waiting for him to make. He did it kindly. That made it worse. Sophie found the calendar invite on her phone after lunch, a meeting with Evan Brooks, Mason's lawyer, to review Lily's guardianship stability and possible protective options. Her whole body went cold. When Mason arrived that evening, she did not let him remove his coat. He explained quickly, badly. He had not meant to interfere. After the accident at the shop and Derek's pressure campaign, he thought it would be wise to understand any legal vulnerabilities before someone else. Use them against her. To Mason it had been preparation. To Sophie it felt like invasion. Lily's guardianship was not a project file. It was the most fragile, sacred part of Sophie's life. She had spent 2 years proving to caseworkers, relatives, school administrators, and herself that she could be enough. Now Mason had stepped into that fear with a lawyer's calendar invite and called it protection. He apologized. She believed he meant it, but meaning it was not enough. Sophie told him apologies would not matter if every fear she shared became something he scheduled, managed, or fortified. She did not need to be converted into a risk profile. That night after he left, Grace called. Sophie's mother had heard enough to worry and not enough to be gentle. Grace reminded her that men with money rarely took over all at once. They began by making life easier. Then they became necessary. Then their help turned into permission. Sophie wanted to defend Mason. Instead, she said nothing. Across town, Mason sat in his office with Evan Brooks, who was both his attorney and the only person willing to insult him without billing extra. Evan listened, then told Mason he was acting like a man in love who still thought romance meant acquiring all future threats before they matured. Mason denied this for approximately 9 seconds, then stopped, because the truth was sitting on his chest. If he could not solve Sophie's problems, what was he worth to her? The answer terrified him. The headline appeared on a Tuesday morning, printed above a photo of Sophie standing outside Second Chance Workshop with sawdust on her jeans and Mason Hart beside her in a rolled-up dress shirt. Small shop owner saved by billionaire developer? Sophie stared at the article on her phone until the words stopped making sense. The piece did not technically lie. That made it worse. It mentioned Mason's visits to the workshop, the legal pressure from Derek Vale, the electrical code notice, and the neighborhood's redevelopment fight. It called Sophie a struggling shop owner, and Mason Portland's most eligible developer, as if her life were a charity auction with romantic lighting. By noon, the whispers started. The florist across the street waved but did not come over. Mr. Alvarez, who usually left a paper bag of bruised peaches by her door, walked past twice without stopping. At the bakery, two women lowered their voices when Sophie entered. She had spent weeks trying to convince the neighborhood Mason's was not there to buy them out. Now people looked at her as if she had sold them in secret and forgotten to collect the receipt. Lily came home from school furious. A boy in her class had said Aunt Sophie was going to marry a billionaire and move into a mansion with rich person stairs. Lily had informed him that big houses were useless because they did not know how to repair chairs, and also that he had the emotional intelligence of a stapler. Sophie wanted to be proud. Mostly, she wanted to cry. Mason's first response was exactly what Sophie feared. He wanted to sue Derek Vale for defamation. He wanted to buy the entire block before Derek could. He wanted to call 3 council members, 2 journalists, and 1 retired judge who owed him a favor. His anger was real. So was his instinct to use power like a fire extinguisher. Sophie stopped him before he made the first call. If Mason bought the block, Derek would win the story. Everyone would believe that when small businesses were threatened, the answer was still a rich man deciding their fate. Different rich man, same ending. Mason paced the workshop floor, visibly struggling against every habit that had made him successful. Sophie laid out her alternative. A public meeting. Tenants, residents, the landlord, press, city officials, and both developers invited. Not a protest built only on emotion, and not a private deal built on fear. A community proposal, drafted by the people who actually lived with the consequences. Mason looked skeptical for exactly half a second. Then he remembered the urgent care clinic, Lily's water cup, and Sophie's voice telling him not to fix the world. He asked what role she wanted him to play. That question still surprised her. She told him, expert, not hero. The meeting was held in a church basement that smelled of old coffee and folding chairs. Every small business owner on the block came. So did residents from the apartments above the shops, 2 reporters, the landlord's attorney, Derek Vale and Mason, who sat beside Sophie instead of at the front. Derek arrived smiling. He wore sympathy like a custom suit. He began by praising community history, which was how everyone knew he intended to erase it. Then he turned to Sophie. His voice remained polite as he explained that sentiment could not pay rent, repair wiring, or bring a building up to code. He said Sophie's workshop was charming, but charm was not a financial model. Without Mason Hart's attention, he implied she would already be gone. Mason's chair scraped backward. Sophie's hand landed on his wrist, not hard enough. He looked at her. She stood. Her knees felt weak. But her voice did not. She admitted she was short on money. She admitted the workshop needed repairs. She admitted there had been nights when she sat on the floor after Lily went to bed and wondered if keeping her father's shop alive was courage or stubbornness wearing his old apron. But being afraid, she said, did not mean she was for sale, and needing help did not mean someone else got to own her voice. The room quieted. Sophie unfolded the proposal the shop owners had built together. A transparent community repair fund. Partnership with the local trade school for supervised electrical and structural work. Phased code upgrades. Verified by independent inspectors. Rent stabilization during renovations. A shared marketing plan that preserved existing businesses instead of replacing them with polished strangers. Mason spoke only when she asked him to. He explained feasibility, numbers, timelines, where Derek's proposal used inflated urgency, where the landlord could access tax incentives without evicting tenants. He did not say he would save the block. He said the community's plan was financially stronger than Derek wanted people to believe. For the first time, his power did not cover Sophie's voice. It carried it farther. Derek saw the room shifting, so he smiled again. Then he revealed the document. A preliminary purchase agreement signed months earlier by Hartwell Urban Development. Mason's company had once intended to acquire the same block. The room erupted. Sophie turned toward Mason. The look on her face hurt worse than any accusation Derek could have made. Mason did not deny it. He said the agreement was real. Before he met Sophie, before he understood the neighborhood, he had seen the block the way developers were trained to see. Underused property, favorable location, redevelopment potential. He had withdrawn from the deal after realizing it was not empty space. It was people's lives, but the explanation came too late. Sophie heard only the part he had hidden. All those nights in the workshop, all those careful questions, all that listening, and underneath it, a signature he had never mentioned. She gathered her papers with shaking hands and walked out before he could follow. Every instinct in Mason screamed at him to go after her. to explain, to promise, to make the hurt stop. But the room was still full of people who had trusted Sophie's proposal. If he left now, Derek would take control of the narrative again. The community plan would collapse into gossip about romance and betrayal. So Mason stayed. He finished the presentation. He answered questions. He committed Hartwell to no purchase rights, no hidden stake, no branding control, only limited technical support under community oversight. He put it in writing before the meeting ended. Later, Sophie heard from Mr. Alvarez that Mason had stayed. Not to win her back, not to perform guilt, to protect the work she had started. It did not erase the betrayal, but it complicated the pain, and somewhere beneath her anger, Sophie understood something she did not yet want to forgive. Mason Hart had finally chosen not to make love the loudest thing in the room.
It's good to see the lights still on.
A few months later, the neighborhood was still standing, not untouched, not magically saved, but standing. The city approved the community renovation model after 3 exhausting hearings, 2 revised budgets, and 1 memorable moment when Mr. Alvarez told a zoning official that historic character did not mean painting old bricks while evicting old neighbors. Hartwell Urban Development did not buy the block. Instead, Mason's company served as a limited technical advisor under a transparent contract written by the community board. No hidden purchase rights, no branding control, no glossy campaign about saving local heritage. Derek Vale lost momentum once the press shifted from scandal to the neighborhood's actual plan. Second Chance Workshop survived, barely some weeks, but barely was still alive. The electrical repairs were finished through the trade school partnership. Students came on Saturdays to learn restoration techniques from Sophie, who discovered she was surprisingly good at teaching people how not to panic when old wood cracked. Lily appointed herself director of object naming, made a paper badge, laminated it badly, and began assigning names to every donated chair, lamp, and table. One unfortunate floor lamp became Gerald the Dramatic. Nobody argued. Mason kept his distance at first, not coldly, carefully. He sent structural notes through the community board. He forwarded legal updates to everyone, not just Sophie. He stopped appearing whenever guilt made him miss her. He learned that restraint could be a love language, though Evan Brooks informed him it was the least marketable one. Still, when Sophie invited him, he came. He brought pizza. He wore old shirts. He ruined coffee with the confidence of a man who had learned nothing from repeated failure. Lily continued tracking his restoration progress. He had improved to a B-, mostly because he had stopped calling emotional conversations alignment. Grace softened slowly. One afternoon, while Sophie sorted receipts, her mother watched Mason sweep sawdust without being asked. Grace said that self-reliance did not mean living as if love were a trap. Sophie pretended not to hear, then cried in the supply closet for 4 minutes. One evening after closing, Sophie called Mason to the workshop. The shop glowed under warm lights. The repaired furniture waited in careful rows. In the center of the room sat Sir Wobbles, except he did not wobble anymore. The old chair had been sanded, braced, stained, and upholstered in deep blue fabric. Its once broken leg held steady beneath it. Sophie turned it over. On the underside, Lily had carved a tiny inscription. Good bones, needed patience. Mason stared at the words. Sophie stood beside him. It's not just about the chair, I know. For once he did not say too much. He did not offer a ring, or a key, or a check, or a plan large enough to frighten the room. He only asked whether she would have dinner with him. A real date, no rescue mission, no emergency agenda, no plan to save anything before dessert. Sophie studied him. All right, she said. But if you call the appetizer a shared asset, I'm leaving. Mason placed one hand over his heart. I'll try to love you in human language. She laughed. Then she took his hand. In the back room, Lily was arguing with Grace about whether a brass lamp looked more like a Mildred or Captain Sparkleboots. The workshop smelled of fresh sawdust, old wood, and something beginning again. Sophie and Mason sat together on Sir Wobbles, the chair that had once been broken and was now strong enough to hold both of them. Their love did not begin when Mason offered to pay her debts. It began when Sophie refused, and Mason stayed long enough to learn that loving someone does not mean buying peace for them. Sometimes it means respecting the way they build it themselves and waiting to be invited to sit beside them. Thank you for watching Soul-Stirring Stories. Until next time, remember, real love does not take over your life and call it rescue. Real love learns where the door is, knocks gently, and waits until you choose to open it.